There are 6 sins that Padre Pio warned could follow a soul straight through Easter, unconfessed, unresolved, and unseen by everyone except heaven. The church was full, every pew occupied. Palm Sunday 1957, San Giovanni Rotondo. People had traveled for days to be there, some from other countries, some on foot. They had come to see Padre Pio celebrate Mass, to receive his blessing, to be near the man whose hands bled the wounds of Christ. But something was different that morning. Those who were present later recalled that Padre Pio stopped during the homily. Not paused, stopped. He gripped the edge of the pulpit with both hands and looked out across the congregation with an expression no one in that church had ever seen on his face before. Not sorrow, not anger, something between the two, something heavier than both. He was silent for what witnesses described as nearly a full minute, a silence so complete that people began to shift in their seats. Children stopped moving. Even the candles seemed to hold still. Then he spoke, slowly, with a weight that those present said they felt in their chests rather than heard with their ears. Many of you will leave this church today and walk through Holy Week as if it were any other week. You will observe the rituals. You will attend the services. You will bow your heads at the right moments. And you will arrive at Easter Sunday, carrying something you have never named, never brought into the light, never placed at the foot of the cross. He paused again. And heaven will have seen all of it. No one moved. What Padre Pio revealed that Palm Sunday morning about what happens to a soul that passes through Easter still carrying these 6 specific sins unconfessed is a warning that most people who call themselves Christian have never been told directly, until now. But what Padre Pio was about to reveal was not simply a list of sins to avoid. It was about something far more dangerous than most people have ever considered. The kind of sin that doesn't announce itself, doesn't feel like sin, and walks confidently through the doors of a church on Easter Sunday, wearing the face of a good Christian. But to understand the weight of what Padre Pio warned that morning, you first need to understand something about who he was as a confessor, something that sets everything he said about sin and the soul apart from anything you have ever heard from an ordinary priest. This is not background information. It is the foundation without which the warning loses the force it was meant to carry. And that is exactly what will be shown right now. Padre Pio spent more than 50 years in the confessional, not occasionally, not as one duty among many. It was the center of his ministry, the place where he believed the most decisive battles for the human soul were fought and won or lost. This is not a general claim. It is documented in the official records of the Capuchin order, in testimonies collected by Vatican investigators, and in the personal accounts of thousands of people who sat across from him in that small wooden confessional in San Giovanni Rotondo. Some of them waited in line for days. Some traveled from across Europe and beyond. Some came as skeptics and left as believers. The consistency of what they reported, the precision with which he identified sins that had never been spoken aloud, the accuracy with which he described the interior state of souls he had never met, made casual dismissal essentially impossible. He was not simply hearing confessions, he was seeing souls. Multiple witnesses, priests, physicians, and ordinary lay people who had no connection to each other, described the same phenomenon. Padre Pio would stop a penitent mid-sentence and name what they had come to confess before the words left their mouth. He would identify sins carried for decades that the person had convinced themselves were too old, too buried, or too complicated to bring into the light. He would distinguish between sins that had been confessed carelessly and sins that had never been confessed at all. And he treated them with entirely different urgency. He was also known to refuse absolution, not out of cruelty, out of a seriousness about the state of the soul that most modern Christians find deeply uncomfortable. He understood something about unconfessed sin that the culture around him, then as now, preferred not to examine too closely. And it is precisely because of this, because of 50 years inside the confessional, because of what he saw in souls that others could not see, that what Padre Pio said about the 6 sins that must be confessed before Easter carries a weight that no theology textbook can replicate. He was not speaking from doctrine alone. He was speaking from what he had witnessed in thousands of souls who arrived at the most sacred season of the Christian year, still carrying what they should have left at the foot of the cross. And now, exactly what those 6 sins are will be revealed. The warning Padre Pio returned to, especially in the days before Holy Week, was this: there are sins that a person learns to live with so completely that they no longer feel like sins at all. Not the sins that cause obvious shame, not the ones that keep a person awake at night with guilt. Those, he said, are actually the easier ones. The soul that suffers over its sin is already moving toward the confessional. The dangerous sins are the ones that have been domesticated, normalized, quietly accepted as simply part of who a person is. This may sound like a distinction without a difference. But Padre Pio understood something about this category of sin that most people spend an entire lifetime never confronting. A sin that has been lived with long enough stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like a wall. And the soul that has built its interior life around that wall no longer sees it as an obstacle. It sees it as a foundation. That, he warned, is when a sin becomes most dangerous, not when it is felt, when it is no longer felt at all. To pass through Easter, through the Passion, the death, and the resurrection of Christ, carrying sins of this kind without bringing them into confession is not simply a missed opportunity. It is, in his words, a soul standing at the open door of mercy and choosing to remain outside. And now, each of these 6 sins will be named, exactly as Padre Pio identified them, exactly as they appear in the lives of people who believe themselves to be living faithfully. One of the most common sins Padre Pio identified in the confessional, especially among people of faith, was unforgiveness disguised as justice. It appears in the person who says they have forgiven but has not forgotten, who has constructed an entirely reasonable case for why the person who wronged them deserved exactly what happened, who does not wish harm on anyone but has quietly closed a door inside their heart and has no intention of opening it again. This sin disguises itself as discernment, as self-protection, as simply being realistic about people. That is precisely why it survives for decades inside souls that pray every day. Padre Pio saw it constantly. He would tell those carrying it that unforgiveness held in the heart does not punish the person who caused the wound. It imprisons the one who refuses to release it. And a soul that arrives at Easter, still imprisoned by that refusal, has missed the entire meaning of the cross. The second sin was pride concealed as virtue. Not the obvious pride of arrogance or boasting, the subtle pride of the person who has quietly decided that their way of seeing things, their judgments, their standards, their assessments of other people and situations, is simply correct, who has never said they are better than others, but has never truly believed otherwise. This sin is almost impossible to self-diagnose because it wears the clothing of conviction, of principle, of simply having standards. Padre Pio understood that this form of pride was among the most resistant to grace because it had already pre-classified itself as something other than sin. He said that heaven sees through the classification immediately. The third sin was spiritual coldness treated as maturity, the person who prays out of habit rather than hunger, who attends Mass because it is what one does, not because they are seeking an encounter with the living God, who has replaced intimacy with routine and called it faithfulness. This sin disguises itself as stability, as the natural progression of a mature faith. But Padre Pio recognized it as one of the most heartbreaking conditions he encountered in the confessional. A soul that had once been on fire and had allowed the flame to reduce to an ember without ever asking why or caring enough to seek the answer. He warned that a soul in this condition can pass through an entire Easter season and feel absolutely nothing, and feel nothing about feeling nothing. The fourth sin was envy buried under concern. It arrives dressed as worry, as genuine interest in the lives of others, as the simple human habit of comparison. But underneath it is a quiet resentment toward those who have what one desires: success, recognition, peace, relationships, faith that seems to come more easily. This sin is particularly insidious because it rarely announces itself honestly. The person carrying it often experiences it as a vague dissatisfaction, a low-grade unhappiness they cannot quite locate. Padre Pio saw it clearly in souls who came to him believing their problem was something else entirely. He said that envy, left unconfessed, poisons gratitude at the root, and a soul without gratitude cannot fully receive what Easter offers. The fifth sin was sins of the tongue never taken seriously, words spoken in anger that were never retracted, reputations quietly damaged through conversations framed as concern, truths told at the wrong moment, to the wrong person, with the wrong intention. Padre Pio had a particular seriousness about this category that surprised many of those who came to him. He did not treat careless words as minor infractions. He understood that words, once released, travel further and cut deeper than the person who spoke them will ever fully know. He would ask penitents directly, "Have you repaired what your words broke?" Not simply confessed it, repaired it. The distinction, he insisted, was not optional. The sixth sin was a life of faith performed rather than lived. This was the one Padre Pio returned to most urgently in the days before Holy Week. The person who fulfills every external obligation of the faith, Mass, prayer, the sacraments, the appearances of devotion, while the interior life remains untouched, unexamined, and fundamentally unchanged year after year. This is the sin that Easter exposes most ruthlessly, because Easter is not about performance, it is about death and resurrection, and a soul that has been performing faith without allowing it to actually transform anything is, in the deepest sense, still in the tomb. He would say, examine your life honestly, not your practices, your life. Ask yourself if the person you were 5 years ago and the person you are today have been genuinely changed by encountering the living Christ, or simply better practiced at the appearance of it. He promised that the soul willing to bring any one of these 6 sins into the confessional before Easter, truly, honestly, without excuse, would experience something in that sacrament that no Easter Sunday homily could produce on its own. And now, what that actually means, and what changes for the soul that chooses to walk through that door, will be shown. That congregation in San Giovanni Rotondo on Palm Sunday 1957 sat in silence for a long time after Padre Pio finished speaking. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of recognition, the silence of people quietly reviewing the inventory of their own interior lives and finding things they had not looked at in a very long time. Several of those present later wrote that they went to confession that same week for the first time in years. Not because they were afraid, because something in the way he spoke made them finally willing to be honest. Padre Pio himself went to confession every single day. The man whose hands bore the wounds of Christ, who was seen bilocating across continents, who read the souls of thousands, he never believed himself to be beyond the need for that sacrament. He approached it not as a formality, but as the most important encounter of his day. That, perhaps more than anything he ever said, is the teaching. The question this warning leaves is simple, and it is uncomfortable. Of these 6 sins, unforgiveness, hidden pride, spiritual coldness, buried envy, careless words, and performed faith, which one have you been living with so long that it no longer feels like something that needs to be confessed? Easter is not a date on a calendar. It is an open door. And the only thing that keeps a soul standing outside it is the decision not to walk through. If this video helped you see something you had not allowed yourself to see before, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like, because warnings like this one need to reach every soul that still has time to act on them, and your participation is what makes that possible.